Hi there, welcome to our latest ALTA Insights webinar, ALTA's free presentations on issues important to title professionals. I'm Lauren Dollarshell, ALTA's Director of Meetings, and today we've got a great webinar lined up for you. Some people believe that the only place where change can happen is in DC's Beltway, but it also happens outside of Washington, DC, at the state level and in local communities. Over these next 45 minutes or so, our experts will discuss real-life examples and share ideas on how you can get involved and advocate for the title insurance settlement industry. Before starting, I'd like to touch on a few housekeeping items. All participants' lines are muted for today's presentation. If at any time you have a question, please submit them through the questions box. We'll hold time at the end for Q&A. And as an added benefit, today's presentation is being recorded. Once it's processed, the recording will be available on ALTA's website at alta.org/webinars. Again, that's alta.org/webinars. I'd also like to thank Qualia for sponsoring today's presentation. And before introducing our speakers, here's a quick word from our sponsor.
Hi there, I am Debbie Brooks, and I am the owner of Prominent Title, along with my husband, Joe Brooks, and we are located in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we are open for business.
My name is Bethany Payton. I'm the manager and majority owner of Total Title LLC, based in Indianapolis, Indiana, and we are open for business.
Hi, my name is Sultana Hawk, and I'm the managing partner of Stonebridge Title Group, the title company that services all of the state of Florida, and we are open for business.
My name is Ray Manuel. I'm the Vice President of Operations and Sales for National Title Solutions, located in Woodridge, Illinois, and we are open for business.
We're not the medical field, but we are still doing something very important, and then that is still holding up this side of the economy. To be considered essential is a privilege.
All right, thank you, Qualia, for that message. Now let's meet today's speakers. First, we have Elizabeth Weissong-Bird. Elizabeth is the Northeast Regional Underwriting Council for Agents National Title Insurance Company, and also serves as Vice Chair to ALTA's State Legislative and Regulatory Action Committee. Next up is Bob Drober. Bob is the New York Land Title Association's Executive Director and an active member on several of ALTA's committees, including Government Affairs, FLRAC, and Data Privacy. And finally, to help lead the conversation today is ALTA's very own Elizabeth Blosser. Elizabeth is ALTA's Senior Director of Government Affairs. Now, Elizabeth, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Awesome, thank you. Before we get started, I want to remind people that you can submit questions through the chat. Unfortunately, we don't get to be together in person very much right now, but we want to make this as interactive as possible. So go ahead and submit questions. If you have things that you've been thinking about or wondering about, just add those as we start the conversation. Don't worry about, oh, are they already going to get to this topic, because your questions will help determine kind of where we go with the conversation. So please go ahead and feel free to get those questions going. So to kick us off, I just kind of want to talk a little bit about what advocacy looks like in the state organizations where the two of you work. And I'm going to start with you, Bob, because there's been a few advocacy efforts happening in New York over the course of the last few years, just a few. I like to say that you are the hardest working person in the land title association industry, and I don't think that that's an understatement at all. So talk to us a little bit about what New York State Land Title Association advocacy looks like, just overall the program.
It feels like I'm the hardest working, but I'm sure there's others that just don't put on as good a show. So we have hundreds, literally hundreds of bills introduced in every 2-year session. It's a lot to plow through. We rely very much so on our lobbyist firm. They will flag bills to us, and when a bill is flagged, I direct it to a 2-person team on our legislative committee. It's usually one underwriter and one agent. They'll rank the bill 1, 2, or 3, sort of a triage, and write some comments about it. Then it goes to an advocacy committee, which is drawn from our leadership, to determine which of these issues are really actionable. And then it may, that may be a phone call or a letter to a bill sponsor. It could be a memo in opposition. It could be an in-person meeting. It may involve a TAN alert. It really has to gear itself to the velocity with which the issue is moving and the kind of impact it has on the industry in New York. A lot of moving parts.
That's a lot to keep track of in a year.
I got help.
That's good. And it sounds like you've got a lot of help too from your members who are the experts on a lot of these topics when it comes to really digging into the policy.
Yeah, we probably have 60 to 80 members who participate at least somehow over the course of the year in a different committee. So very, very highly engaged membership.
Great. So Elizabeth, what about you? You're in Indiana, so a different size state, different politics. You know, we all say politics is local, and it is. It's very different from state to state on what the priorities are and the types of things you see. So tell us a little bit about advocacy in Indiana and some of the other, I can't even remember all the state associations that you assist with your ledge committee on. So you're out there doing a lot of good work.
Yeah, so my primary states are Indiana and then Illinois and Ohio, where I help with legislative efforts. I am the government affairs chair in Indiana, and we do something similar to what New York does. We have a government affairs committee that is comprised of 50 folks that really want to be involved in our advocacy efforts. And what we do is at the beginning of session, our lobbyist also does a sort for us, and we have specific words, kind of like what you do for SLURAC, Elizabeth, where if there's a certain bill and it hits, what we do is we have about 10 groups made up of 5 or 6 people, and we read every single bill. It does depend on what is happening. I agree with Bob. Is it moving fast? Indiana is interesting in our politics, and it's different from state to state because we have a super majority of Republicans on both the House and Senate sides. And then our governor has been Republican for quite a while. So what we have to be careful of is making sure that things that are agreed to didn't move too fast and that we didn't have a chance to see them and it didn't get past just bang, bang, bang. So that's our primary concern sometimes is there's too much agreement.
Well, or, you know, to your point, when things move really quickly, you don't always have time to digest all the details, and there's little tiny pieces that come up later. And I think we all who work in advocacy, you know, we stay awake at night worried about unintended consequences, right? Like, what did we potentially miss as we were pushing this forward?
Absolutely.
We also have a one-party legislature and state house in New York. Not Republicans, Democrat, but it really changes the dynamics of how you have to operate when you have one party dominating your state government.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care for it.
Yeah, and we actually, for the folks online, I don't know how many folks are familiar with what happened in Indiana. We had something go through in the last week of session, and it was a one-word change from an or to an and it has now made it in Indiana that we have to have a witness at every closing where we didn't in the middle of a pandemic. And yeah, it just went lickety split and we missed it, didn't see it. So we're working on that.
See, your legislative session is done and you're still in the midst of tons of advocacy work on that. I know you've been really busy.
Yes. This year especially, I think it's been interesting because we ended our session, they ended early because they were worried about COVID. And that was in the middle of March, because what we do in Indiana, we have a short session every other year. And then the other year is a long session, which is the budget year. We're getting ready to go into a budget year. This was a short session from January to March, and it's supposed to be not a whole lot of bills, but man, it felt like a long session and it was crazy. And then everything ended super fast because everyone wanted to go home because of COVID, and I don't blame them. So yeah, it was even more fast and furious. And then we're trying to figure out what courthouses were open.
Right.
So it's been a year.
Yeah. It's been, you know, all of the sessions were a little bit abbreviated this year. Some of them have actually been extended to more days than usual because they're meeting at different times, and a lot of questions about what can you do and not do remote in specific states. So it has made advocacy a little bit more challenging in these times. And we have to figure out ways to be creative and be reaching out to folks. So I kind of want to get in right away and talk. So this was a great overview of this is kind of what happens in the states. The federal level is very similar. You kind of have this legislation you're looking at. You need your experts and your advocates. But let's be honest, like if you're thinking about getting involved in advocacy, that can be kind of scary, right? I mean, you're like, oh, I'm going to go meet with a member of Congress. I'm going to go meet with a state senator and talk about policy. And I see other people doing it, and I see it's super impactful, and we're having wins, and these people seem to be having fun doing the advocacy, but it's kind of intimidating. And so, you know, we've all experienced it. What are some of the tools either of you would recommend, or what are some of the words of encouragement or advice you would give people who say, I really want to be involved, but this is a little scary?
Well, we draw heavily on ALTA's experience. So a lot of preparation, talking points, handouts, floor maps of the different legislative offices, anything to lower the spooky factor about being in this impressive place. I think the main thing we do, we'll do a briefing beforehand, but the number one thing is always making sure that there is somebody who is an experienced, either member of a lobbying firm or someone from the association leadership. So we never put any rookies out there in the deep end of the lake all by themselves. And we'll find that if we're doing a series of meetings, you know, the first meeting of the day, they're sitting there with their hands clasped and their jaws clenched. And by the second or third meeting, they're edging us out and they want to get their 2 cents in. So I think it's really a matter of just diving in, providing that buddy system, and most people, they kind of gravitate to it. I mean, they overcome that objection and find out that the staffers and the legislators are very accessible. And I keep reminding people, you know, they want your vote. I mean, they want to like you. They want to tell you stuff that you want to hear. They may not act that way, but you will hear nice things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing that we do a similar thing. We don't necessarily have specific meetings that we set up on our lobby day. What we do is a breakfast, and we can talk about that more. But what we also do is make sure that we connect the legislator and know, like myself, our lobbyists, folks that have been the government affairs chair, we know our legislators and who they are, but we want to make sure that we have that connection and introduce them. One other item that I always remind people is, they don't always remember what we do. They kind of know what we do. And it's just that introduction also, right? Of just saying, this is what I do for my community. You know, I help small businesses, you know, get a mortgage and buy land. And when people start talking about what they do every day, and again, to your point, Bob, they want to hear our story. They want to be reelected. They want to know how they can help. Most people don't get into public service because they don't want to help folks. And so, yeah, just having that start to explain, yeah, people get more comfortable. The other item that I like to encourage folks to do is, if you know your legislator or you have a connection in your hometown, take them out to coffee. You know, absolutely, the State House, when we go there and everyone's wearing their suit and it's the middle of session, it can be crazy, it's intimidating. But going out and having coffee with a connection, you know, and just talking about your business and, hey, how are your kids doing, whatever, that's a little bit easier for some folks also that are more adept at a one-on-one conversation, as opposed to getting up and speaking on a topic in front of everyone.
Yeah, and I do think, I mean, advocacy is fun. I think once you get started and you say, hey, I can make a big difference, you just want to do more. You want to be more involved. I would say too, so I've worked as a staffer in state legislatures, I worked for a member of Congress, and it is absolutely impossible for members or staff to be subject matter experts on every topic, but they're dealing with every topic. And so, you know, when I was in a congressional office, we would say, okay, you know, this topic has come up, who do we go to on that? And we really had our go-to people in the community who we knew were experts in a particular area. And to your point, Elizabeth, that's why it's good to keep telling your story, reminding them who you are, that you're associated with the title industry. It may feel really repetitive to you, but they're meeting with lots of people, and that reminder just keeps you on their radar screen, you know, when something comes up. And I think that that's our advocacy lane too, to be in, right? To be the subject matter experts for our industry. And that's another thing that kind of takes away the intimidation. But you know, Bob, do you have stories about, you know, legislators kind of coming to you, to your members, sort of that value of being the subject matter expert and being able to talk about what you do every day?
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things we've tried very hard to do is establish that credibility, that street cred, and in a lot of cases, because our lobbyists are walking the halls, well, they used to, but they're known as like, oh yeah, you have the title people, don't you? And so, you know, we're called upon if it's about, you know, building loan agreements or land recordation. There's a whole range of issues, not just strictly, you know, indemnifying the financing of a piece of property, but a lot of other ones. And we're always working to build our relationships with the, you know, the bar association and the credit unions and the mortgage lenders and the bankers association, because there's always that degree of overlap, and we just try and go to that as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing that we've tried to do also, and I think this helps with credibility, is help out in those areas that, again, may not be directly related to title insurance perfectly. But one of our legislators was working, and has been for a couple of years now, on egregious land contracts, where people are really taking advantage of folks that can't afford attorneys, or are going to agree to terms where the house is uninhabitable and they're going to be foreclosed on by these folks and their money taken. You know, and it was one of those, they reached out and said, hey, we're working on this. And we had a lot of ideas to make their bill better as far as recording what the land contract actually should say or have in it, because we see the good ones and we see the bad ones in our profession. And that gave us a lot of credibility with that member, who I now have his personal cell phone and email in my phone. And he reaches out, like, I saw this bill, you know, what can we do? Because legislators, depending on the state, you may not have a lot of practicing attorneys. So they have this great idea on something they want to do that affects us. And we want to make sure that we can help them, and then also provide them ideas to make their bills even better.
So what about, I think this is probably one of folks' number one fears. What if you get asked a question you don't know the answer to? How do you manage that along with your credibility? Bob, I'll push that one over to you, Bob.
It's never happened, but if it did, well, obviously you acknowledge, you know, that's a great question. Boy, only a smart person would think of that question. I think it's quite all right to always say, I want to get back to you. I want to give you a really thoroughly researched answers. It's not like being on Jeopardy and Alex Trebek is going to fine you if you don't get the answer correctly. I think candor is really important. You just have to be yourself, be honest, and you know, if you are going to get back, you got to get back to them. You got to deliver on what you say. And in many cases, you know, after the meeting, I'm on my phone, and before the end of the day, somebody has put together the information that the legislator is looking for, and it's on their staffer's desk while it's still fresh in their mind. So I think it's a boogeyman. It's a false concern. It really should never be a problem, because unless you're dealing with a legislator who's really a jerk and has just really got their knives out for you, if they really want to know, they'll be happy to get a good answer.
Well, and I think you could potentially even look at it as an opportunity, right? Instead of being like, oh, I'm going to choke up because there's something I don't know the answer to. It gives you the opportunity to immediately follow up with information, and then you've got an email chain going. You have another sort of piece of the connection happening. So sometimes I like the way you describe that, Bob, as sort of a false flag in a way that it shouldn't be a concern. So Elizabeth, you've talked a lot about you've built personal relationships with members, and I think relationships are so key in any business and any sort of thing, and all of our members are obviously savvy professionals. We know that it's important to build relationships, to build trust, to have that credibility. So talk a little bit about, maybe a little bit more about how you've done that. You've given one example, but then maybe how you're leveraging that now and how that might be helpful in this time of COVID, where it's a little bit harder to get a sit down face-to-face meeting with someone. Well, it's impossible.
Yes, it is very impossible right now. And yes, Indiana Land Title right now, we are leveraging every single relationship that we have to try and get this witness out of our closing room. And part of that literally is just explaining and walking through, no one meant this, it was a whoopsie daisy, and we need your help. And it literally is going through the list of contacts that I have on my phone. Our lobbyist obviously is a huge help with that. But then also, who in our membership has a relationship with the speaker pro tem? Who has a relationship with the House Speaker that is personal, where they can actually say, this is how it's affecting my business. This is how much it's costing me. Help. Like, I really need your help. And we are in election year this year. So do you want us to come out in November? We need your help right now. So yeah, those relationships that are personal, and especially everyone's back home right now. No one is leaving their house. Our legislators, they have to have full-time jobs. We don't pay them enough that they can only be a legislator. So they are also working under the same constraints. And they're understanding how COVID's affecting their businesses. But yeah, it's just literally reaching out however we do it. If it's a telephone call, if it's an email, Pony Express, I don't care. How does that legislator like to communicate? How are you comfortable communicating so that you're authentic to yourself also?
It's interesting.
If I could just say a little bit more about relationships, obviously the relationship with the legislator and their staff is very, very important. But we try to look at it sort of like something that wraps around. We'll look at really hyper local media. What's the patch website in that district? What are the institutions or organizations in that district? Is there anything we can do to like target messaging there? Because it's very, very powerful when they see our name in their community newspaper, if they hear it mentioned on their local cable channel. On the other end of the spectrum, the head of the owner of our lobbying firm worked for this governor and worked for his father. Our media communications people occasionally take sabbaticals to do projects for the governor right now. So there's it's not just with the legislature, because certainly in New York, and I think it's not uncommon, there is a structure and there is a political hierarchy. So sometimes knowing the ranking member can be as important as knowing the majority member. And those are the kind of things that you kind of like nurture them, and you sort of put them aside for the day, that rainy day that you're going to need them, but you can never stop paying attention to.
Mm-hmm. And with that too, staff can be so important to your legislator. One, to get the meetings, but then if the legislative assistant or their scheduler, if you have a great relationship with them, you get on their schedule a lot easier. And then I also had a few people reaching out on this witness problem that weren't the legislator, but they're like, really, how can we fix this? I'm like, here's 10 ideas. It's everyone. And yeah, getting the right person and knowing when to use them is so important. I couldn't agree.
And it takes time. You have to be willing to invest months and years to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. And I would agree, those staff relationships are key. If, you know, staffers know that you're a helpful person and you're gonna give them good information that they can utilize, they're gonna come back to you over and over again. From the ALTA perspective, we have congressional liaisons program, and we have a survey set up so that people can go in and kind of list out who they have a connection with and kind of how that connection came about. And it's always interesting because you may think, oh, I don't really know anybody, but if you thought about it and you looked at the list of names of state and federal and local elected officials, you'd be like, oh, I actually do have a connection. I think we're all connected, you know, way more than we think. And so many of our members are involved in their communities and local community organizations and volunteer groups. And that brings a lot of credibility to what you're saying. I will do a little ad for any state land title association looking to identify who their members have relationships with on the state level. Reach out to me and it can help you put a survey together and get that out, because it's so key to know where those relationships are. And then to Bob's point, you got to nurture them. You got to grow them. And, you know, a lot of times it's today's freshman, you know, House member who's coming in who may not have a lot of say today, may have a huge amount of say in a couple of years. So I think too, building those relationships when people are first coming into office is also important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we actually had that experience. We donated money to the wrong candidate who used to be the head of the judiciary and was a great friend to our industry, and he lost. And it's okay, because what we then did to, you know, there wasn't any hard feelings. The candidate who won recognized why we did what we did. But yeah, we reached out to that new senator and said, hi, we're Indiana Land Title Association. This is what we do. And we're just friendly and helpful, because this member was going to, you know, events where she was the new senator and no one really knew her or recognized her. So it's always, you know, not knowing what someone looks like, but introducing yourself to that person that looks a little lost. I mean, she wasn't lost, but you know what I'm saying? Just feeling it out and like, well, this is what we do. You know, we talk about our stuff. We have a nice cocktail over here. It's great. Hi. Tell me about yourself.
Well, you bring up a really good point, Elizabeth, talking about sometimes, you know, you do end up on the wrong side of an issue or a campaign or something like that with an elected official, and you have to rebuild the relationship. Bob, is that something you have tips for? How do you go back and sort of repair relationships with members?
Well, our political action committee tries to, you know, spread the love around, and we try not to make too many enemies. But I don't know that it's really been a case of us backing the wrong horse. I mean, it usually comes down to a matter of issues and public policy. And if you're consistent with your public policy, sometimes you do have to sit down with a committee chair and say, look, this didn't turn out the way we wanted it to, but we're still concerned about keeping the industry healthy and making sure that consumers are protected. And I think if you can stay focused on high-level issues, you can sort of get beyond that, you know, partisanship. Mm-hmm. And actually focus on issues in public policy. That's how I think you have to do it.
Mm-hmm. And I think time heals sometimes too, because we're in the thick of things during session every year. I mean, Indiana, we're the Hoosier state. We're supposed to be hospitable all the time. Well, we're not necessarily. We've had legislators yelling at each other in the hallways, but then time goes away and everyone's a little bit better and the time heals. Thank goodness we're not in session all the time. But yeah, I mean, there has to be a pause, and yeah, this is why it stunk, and everyone acknowledged why we disagree, and we kind of move on sometimes.
Yeah, poor Bob. They're in session pretty much all the time in New York. But to your point, Elizabeth, I think non-session time. So we think about advocacy during session when we have a bill we care about, but advocacy is a 365 sort of thing, and a lot of times it's easier to get on somebody's schedule and build that relationship if you're reaching out during times that session is not happening, and it's not, you know, a time when their focus is going in a million different directions. I want to talk about lobby days and going to the Capitol. I was very sad we weren't able to do Advocacy Summit this year when everybody comes to Washington and you go sit on Capitol Hill on the steps with your breaks between meetings and you see all of your title friends go by, and it's so fun to advocate for the industry. So we'll see. Hopefully we can be back next year. But Bob, you've done something really interesting with district lobby days. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that works?
Yeah, I mean, if we can get 12 or 15 people to go to a lobby day in the Capitol, that's a good turnout. It's a 2 to 4 hour drive for most of our members. And whether you have 1 meeting or 4 meetings, it's a day out of the office. What we've been pretty successful with is encouraging people to meet with their legislators in district. And that may even be on a day that the legislature is not in session, or when the legislature may be home for vacation or campaigning. A lot more members are willing to do it because it's a 15-minute drive to the local office. You're probably going to get 30 minutes or more with the legislator, as opposed to maybe 10 minutes and maybe only with a staffer. And it's a much less intimidating environment to meet in. And once again, nobody goes in who's a rookie. We always have someone with them who's done it before, and all the other stuff, the briefing in advance and the handouts and the leave behinds, all of that stuff is there, but it's a much less relaxed atmosphere. And the meetings are much more likely to start out with my member who lives in the district and the legislator passing some stories back and forth about, the parade or the picnic or the Little League game or some local diner that everybody loves. And it just creates a much more relaxed atmosphere. Also, the member gets to say, yeah, a lot of people in this town, I helped them close on their house. I helped them get the get their title insurance. And it's much harder to create that mood when you're in the state capitol. On the other hand, the state capitol has other advantages because it's, more impressive and bombastic and as an imposing building. But we've gotten a lot of our members who had their first lobbying experience with an in-district lobbying visit.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So what about you, Elizabeth? I think that you talked a little bit about maybe a breakfast, some bacon and maple syrup, some coffee happening.
Yeah, so what we've realized that helps us in Indiana to attract our legislators to come by is bacon and French toast. So how our state house, and we refine this over years and years, we actually sponsor breakfast, and it starts from 7:30 to 9:30. I know it's hard in some states to do that. It's very nominal, the cost, and we figured out where they park their cars and where they have to walk through in order to get to any of their meetings in our state house. So they have to walk through the North Atrium, and by golly gee, maple syrup and bacon draws them in. And now we've been doing this for several years. They know that ILTA is going to have a hot breakfast because it's just like an ALTA event. If there's hot breakfast for whatever reason, people are happier. And they know that ILTA is here with French toast and bacon, and it's fresh coffee. We also don't limit, like staff comes down all the time and gets our French toast and bacon because you can't obviously say no to people. That would be rude. So that's what we do. And we do have the leave behinds there. And again, that's where our lobbyists, myself, Danielle Kaiser, Danielle Christian, Kurt Laker, folks that used to be GA chairs really make those connections, because we're lucky, even in January in Indiana, with always a snowstorm or ice storm, we still get 50 people roughly at this breakfast, and then have a couple hours of education afterwards. So
I would be remiss if I didn't mention at this point that every state has different rules about kind of what you can and cannot do. So make sure that you're paying attention to that and figuring it out, because I think that Bob would be in a completely different situation in his state with something like that. Bob, you can speak to that. And then I'm also curious, I think it would be great if people could just get an idea, when it's crunch time in New York and you call a member to the State House to do some lobbying, what is it like? Like, what happens? How do they get to hearing rooms? How do they get to their meetings? Talk a little bit about that experience for folks, because I think it is pretty exciting. Maybe, you want to do that in district first, but exciting stuff to be part of.
Well, typically we would set up a meeting in the legislator's office, but a couple of years ago we had some issues that were really urgent, and we had to bring people up there when both the Senate and the Assembly were in session. So we did lobbying off the floor, and so our members literally stood in the lobby, hence the term, in the lobby of the Senate chamber, the Assembly chamber, wrote the name of their legislator on the back of their business card, handed it to the sergeant of arms, who brings it into this chamber. You stand around in this crush of people, your legislator comes out, and you've got 2 to 3 minutes to make your point. And the necessity of condensing your message just to its essence is a really, really good exercise. Because you just carve away everything else, you get right to the point, and you tell the legislator why this is important. Their responses and their questions are going to be equally laser sharp. Typically, we'll have one of the lobbyists with them, or as I said, one of the members of leadership, and it almost invariably ends up with like, okay, get me more information. I want to know more about this. But just being in that environment and seeing this is where they work, and this is at least in New York State, it's a very historical and storied structure. People really get the bug, and it's one of the best ways we've grown our cadre of members who are politically engaged. And from there, it's a really short step to them doing an in-district meeting, and they'll write a check for the PAC. And it's a progression, which is a very positive and optimistic direction to take.
I'm inspired. I want to come to your next lobby day, Bob. Be fun.
You're invited. You're invited.
Excellent. So you guys have both brought up your lobbyist, and I know that this is a question for state associations to get a lobbyist, to not get a lobbyist. Can you shed some light on some of the things that your lobbyist does for you, where you find value and how that works? Go over to you first, Elizabeth.
Absolutely. So our lobbyist, Charlie Heltunen, he used to be the person that goes over the rules for the legislature on the House side. He knows the rules backwards, forwards, and how the legislature actually works. So for us, that's invaluable. I can tell him all day how title insurance works and random property laws, but I don't know the special rules that are in place and how it works on a day-to-day basis. Charlie's great at that. He's also invaluable because he's been doing this for about 25, 30 years. He's friends with Vice President Mike Pence. They went to law school together. So our lobbyist he shoots guns with our First Lady. Like, he's very connected and is a jolly person and has those connections that I don't. And that's very important for us. But the bigger thing is he just knows everybody and knows those rules backwards and forwards. So if there's something crazy. I mean, he gets called on bills that have nothing to do with anything that he's working on. It's just, Charlie, how does this work? And having that person in your corner to help you to get your agenda done and just explain how things work, it's really invaluable. I know if there are land title associations trying to figure out whether they would like to invest, it's not free, but if you do have a specific agenda, having someone to help you navigate that, even just a little bit, is priceless in my opinion.
Yeah, I think too. Over to you, Bob.
I think if budget is an issue, and it's always going to be an issue, hire somebody part-time. Just get your toe in the water. As Elizabeth said, our lobbyist is able to explain these arcane rules that the Senate and the Assembly operate. I mean, it's a different set of physics for time and space when you get to the state capitol. It just doesn't seem normal. So obviously, not only on the issues, but also on the mechanics of how the state government works, it's really, really helpful. But our lobbyists have also been really helpful, number one, in educating me when I first took the job, but in educating our leadership. And it's sort of a trickle down thing. Our lobbyist comes to our annual meetings and our conventions, has personal connections with various members in the association. And so it just raises the general baseline level of understanding of how the legislative process works and who the players are. And so I was going to say, you know, our lobbyist has been doing this for 30 years and he knows where all the bodies are buried, but someone said, you'd better explain that that's a figure of speech in New York. There really are no bodies buried, but he does understand the relationships. And we've gone and talked to legislators about bills, and he said, gee, I don't even remember sponsoring this bill. And oh, that's right, it was sponsored by someone who retired and I picked it up. And so having that historical perspective can sometimes really make you stand out and show that you're invested and you're not just showing up because you want to accomplish one thing and then you're going to go back and doing what you're doing, or that you are interested in public policy.
Yeah, and I would say to any state LTA kind of looking to, you know, invest in a lobby firm, talk to a couple of different firms, get their credentials, find out what other groups they advocate for. And then it may be a thing where you have, you know, an agreement with them for every other year. If there's a year where you have a larger session versus a smaller session or no session. I mean, I think there's ways to try and make the budget work, especially if you know you're going to have a key piece of legislation coming up and you want help, you know, running the traps through all the committee hearings and figuring out how all of that works, because it is a whole different system and you kind of got to know how to make that work with your legislation.
If I could just add one more point to that, is that the fact that our lobbyist firm represents other clients before the Department of Financial Services, as well as clients that are in other areas of regulatory areas, gives them a reason to talk to a lot of people. So they might get a meeting for another client, but on the way out the door, they'll use that as an opportunity to drop a line for us. So you can get points of leverage by getting the right lobbying firm and grow with them. You have to invest time to educate them. They are not going to know the title business, and they're probably going to take maybe 2 or 3 or more years to really begin to understand what the industry is like. So look at it once again as a relationships you're going to invest in.
Mm-hmm. That's great advice. So lobbyists, what about a PAC? To have a PAC or not to have a PAC? I would say some of our state associations do, some don't. On the national level, we have TIPAC, which has been great for us to help build relationships. Elizabeth Berg, do you guys have a PAC? What do you think? What's your advice?
Absolutely, we have a PAC. It's ITPAC. We're not too creative with the name. what that does, it gets me another meeting, or it gets a member if we have someone that is in that district with key persons. So that's another opportunity when we're outside of session. Obviously, we're not taking checks to the court or to the state house because that's illegal. But it's another opportunity to have a meeting to say this is what really affects us, and in key races to potentially do that last minute ad buy for someone that has really helped us in the past, and looking at those things. It's also, honestly, for Indiana, it's another fun way to get together, right? So we've done golf outings, we've gone bowling, we've had at our convention, if you donate a certain amount, you get to go to a special cocktail reception with the president, which is not always exciting because it could be me or Kurt. But it's another opportunity to foster the association and what it actually does for membership if advocacy is a large part of your organization.
Yeah, I want to emphasize, and I don't think it can be overemphasized, you really have to make sure that you're not talking about issues when you're handing out checks, and
right.
You're not talking about money when you go in to talk about issues. It's a line you have to really adhere to closely. We have a chair of our PAC committee. She's been the chair of the PAC committee for several years. She's pleasant, personable, an unassuming personality. She was scared to death when she first started being the chairman of the PAC, and now she can sit and have a glass of wine with the governor and just about anybody in the state, and has come to be sort of like part of our brand on that level. And once again, as Elizabeth was saying, you want to make sure that people who understand the contribution of the title industry are in government. And it's not so much to try and get a particular outcome out of them. It's just knowing that when you do have an issue, there will be people there who understand what it is you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
That's about the most you can hope for. Yeah. And spread your money around to both sides of the aisle.
Yeah, you have to be really thoughtful about how you approach the PAC, and the rules for PACs and how you run them and what the reporting requirements are and things also vary pretty drastically from state to state. So that's another thing to make sure you've got somebody who can help you navigate that. So one more topic, and then we're going to go to questions. You both, I think, at one point or another mentioned partnerships with other associations or groups. We work a lot with Mortgage Bankers Association, National Association of Realtors. I work a lot with PRIA, which is county recorders nationwide. And you have to have these relationships. A lot of times you have issues that intersect. How do you build those relationships when you have an issue that comes up? How do you entice them to get on board and support you? And when you are on different sides of an issue, how do you navigate that? So I'm going to go over to you first, Elizabeth, and what are some thoughts? You've got a big issue you're working on right now with pretty much all of those groups, right?
Yes. So after session ended in March, and when we were trying to figure out first what courthouses were open, we were all rowing in the same direction. And now with this and versus or situation, when everyone realized July 1st, we've got an extra person in the closing room during a pandemic, we've all been rowing in the same direction. And that's really going to help in 2021 if we don't do our other things to get that legislation passed, hopefully very quickly. There are times, and we were fighting tooth and nail over an issue in February and March with MBA and other bankers over title agent liability when there's a title policy issue, because they want to sue our folks in tort in Indiana. Like, don't pass that around that that's a potential. And we've been working on that for several years and just fighting tooth and nail saying you can't do this. Like, we need help. This makes absolutely no sense because we've got some bad case law. So it's one of those two where it's interesting because of our supermajority situation. They want everything more. They really don't want to have us duke it out at a committee hearing. But at the same time, sometimes you just take a position that is completely different. We had someone wanting to change our good funds legislation a couple of years ago, and SB 163 just gnaws my heart. And we had different positions, and you just have to say, hey, I understand you have a different position, that's fine, but this is where we're going with it, because we're not taking a cashier's check from a person across the street. I'm sorry, no.
You know, there's been a couple of themes that have popped up in almost in many areas. You know, we've talked about having expertise and being a subject matter expert. We've talked about the importance of FaceTime, the importance of having a PAC that can spend some money, you know, finding issues that you have a common interest in. And that's really that's your toolkit for advocacy, that and getting out the vote, I suppose. So all of those things come into play with the county clerks and the recorders. You know, we try and have regular phone communication, attend their conferences. The Bar Association will show up and will buy ads in their program and make sure they know that we're around. For the realtors, we've helped a great deal as being subject matter experts in areas that you know, we have a handle on, and it's always a little bit of this, maybe a little bit more of that, and as the situation changes. But those are really, I think, the buckets that you have to work from.
Mm-hmm.
All right, with that, I'm going to see if Lauren can hop back on and join us and see if we've got a question or two to answer.
We do. So I know you guys touched on this a little bit at the beginning. So what if you're a newbie to advocacy? Where do you guys recommend starting?
Well, I'll go first and say join the Title Action Network. You know, alta.org/can. You're on an email list, so you'll know when there's opportunities to take action. But I'm sure Elizabeth and Bob have thoughts from a state LTA perspective.
Well, I would agree that the biggest benefit for me has been going to the ALTA Advocacy Summit, the lobby day. I think the best thing you can do to start is look at somebody who's doing it right and doing it well, and try and learn your lessons from them. And then scale it to what you're capable of doing, and have a plan to get some quick wins, start to build consensus within your organization. You can't do it if it's just a few people. You have to take the time to really make that part of the consciousness of your entire membership.
Mm-hmm. And if it's an individual that just wants to get started, that hasn't participated yet in their LTA, and they already have, and their LTA already has an advocacy group, if someone calls me up and says, hey, you know, how do I do this? I'll be like, I'll get you a call. Charlie will get you a meeting and we'll go with you. If you are interested, we will take you. Any warm body that's willing to talk about what we do every day is only going to help our association.
That's right, Elizabeth.
We take all volunteers.
I love it. So we actually have a question about a meeting, considering that you just mentioned them. So how do you salvage a meeting that isn't going well?
End it quickly and follow up as to politely why they're wrong, if you can. Yeah, sometimes you get in a meeting. I had a couple actually outside of Senate chambers this past session where I knew the member was not going to agree with me and was dogged about it, like, you're wrong. And I'm like, oh, thank you for your time. All right, we'll go around the other way. And they just won't have a house hearing. I don't know. Yeah, sometimes you just have to get out. That's my advice.
I can't improve on that advice.
Okay, well then let's switch gears to what are some general expectations you have in a lobby firm?
That's a good question. I think, you know, I would start with, you know, some of the things we already talked about. Who else do you advocate for? What other roles have you had? Have you worked for the state legislature? Do you have the relationships with the members, you know, sort of help? Are you able to be partisan if that's needed? You know, do you have the relationships with the right leaders, you know, in the legislature from both chambers? Those are the things I think of. What would you guys add?
I think you want to find a lobbyist who will listen, who will take the time to learn enough about your business, because not only is the industry somewhat arcane, but then we have our own internal dynamics between the interests of underwriters, the interests of agents, the interests of other parties who are involved. And it's not immediately obvious, because if your lobbyist is going to run into the lobbyists for the bar association and the realtors and the credit unions and the mortgage bankers, they have to understand where their client or your interests are in those kinds of things. So I would say look for someone who's willing to listen and willing to invest the time to learn your business.
Mm-hmm. That's I can't emphasize that more, Bob, because yeah, yeah, they've got to know where you're going to be at, because that's the thing too. They're not always going to have, your lobbyist is not always going to have you with them. They're not going to have someone that is in the industry all the time, because they're going to get pulled out in the hallway too. Like, what do you think of this? Like, I just saw this in conference committee. And if they don't have that background and they're just making it up, that's really scary for our industries.
Yeah. Okay, last question here, and this might be directed to you, Elizabeth Blosser. How does the state LTA use the Title Action Network?
Well, that's a great question. And actually, Bob and Elizabeth Berg could answer this too. Basically, you just have to reach out to us, say, here's an issue. We'll talk to you about which legislators do you want to target, because we can target down to committees, specific folks. When do you want it to go out? I actually worked on Friday with Elizabeth Berg on an alert, and we're happy to help you draft the messaging and get that out. And then we get some reports back to you on how it's going. We can send out reminders. And I will say, with the Title Action Network, our best responses are always to state alerts. Our members really care what's happening in the state legislatures. Have to give a major shout out to New York State Land Title Association, because they have been consistently the strongest TAN state. We've had great opportunities to work with them on alerts. So we have the technology and we're here to help.
I just want to add, we've also used TAN to reach into some of the regulatory agencies. And in cases, a couple of rare cases, we've even focused it on the county level. So TAN has done some really great slicing and dicing of the data so that we can target, and the ability to mobilize that much sentiment in a short amount of time is very impressive if it's used correctly as part of a formula. You can't just use TAN and walk away and figure my work is done here. But it gets people engaged. It lets the target know that there's a groundswell of concern about an issue. Mm-hmm. Yay, TAN.
As Elizabeth had mentioned, ALTA Advocacy Summit, she mentioned ALTA Advocacy Summit, so I'd like to share those dates with you. Next year's event will take place May 3rd through the 5th. It's a truly unforgettable experience. It's like nothing else you will get to do within this industry, so hope each of you will be able to join. If this and other regulatory related topics interest you, I'd like to recommend registering for virtual ALTA 1, October 6th through 8th. The early bird rate for all ALTA members is $349 and ends September 14th. If you're not a member of ALTA, man, do I have got a deal for you this year. $500, your registration fee is covered, and you and your company will be given ALTA membership through the end of 2020. So that means once one person becomes a member, then the rest of everyone else in your company will be able to get the member rate. And finally, I'd like to thank Qualia once again for sponsoring today's webinar. And to our audience, I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Thank you and take care.